On our last program, we began to unravel the mystery of Mystery Babylon. And we took note that Revelation 17 and 18 talks about a city that sits upon 7 hills. When John wrote this in AD 96, he was referring to Rome as a metaphor of the future Mystery Babylon. For a few years before, you recall, the city of Rome had been burned, and the Christians had been blamed for setting it afire. As a result of that, the ungodly emperor, who was called the first century Antichrist, Nero, had the Apostle Paul beheaded and Peter crucified. And so we have a lot of the apostles and a lot of the Christians being persecuted during the first century as a result of this burning of Rome. Well, Mystery Babylon here is pictured as a city that will burn. And I think the fact that Rome burned at one time and the Christians were accused of it is the metaphor for that. When we get over here to verse 20, he promises the holy apostles and prophets that God will avenge their blood. I think this was a reference to Paul and Peter, who had been crucified and executed by Rome. But what we really come down here is a future global village. This city is not just a single city, but a future global village, a worldwide merchant banking system. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me commercial Babylon.
Commercial Babylon, J.R., and commercial Babylon is essentially the Babylon that was the mercantile trafficker in all kinds of wares in the early Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenician traders, and they were called in Ezekiel 27 the merchants of Tarshish, because Tarshish was their European port of call, which is in present-day Spain. In fact, the city is still there. It's called Tortosa today. But the Phoenician traders trafficked all over the world, literally, particularly in Europe, Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. And as they touched base at each of their ports of call with every kind of merchandise you could possibly imagine, they did so on the basis of a merchant credit system. That is, they were trusted. They were trusted to transcend national boundaries. These men traded between nations, and their entire existence was based upon a system of trust, which later became institutionalized as the law of, called the merchant law or the law merchant.
It's kind of interesting that this word credit comes from the word credo, which means I believe.
Yes.
And so these men had a trust established as they traveled in their ships from port to port, picking up commodities, unloading commodities. And this was the underlying influence of what became merchant banking. Bankers, the international banking cartel is not really so much concerned with loaning money and receiving payments and interest. They deal more in making deals, the commodities of oil and natural resources, the GATT treaty, the NAFTA treaty, and so on. And the fascinating thing about it is, Gary, it goes back all the way back to Babylon and to the original idea that we're going to take over the world, we're going to have a one world system, and the controlling or the enslavement of people, the souls of men, I think is most important. Let's look at Jezebel for a few moments and get an idea of her part to play in this Mystery Babylon system.
Jezebel married King Ahab of the 10 northern tribes. and J.R., the 10 northern tribes were very, very wealthy. They had been blessed of God. They had really a surplus of crops. They had a surplus of trade, goods. They were in a very fine position. Now, Ahab, when he was wed to Jezebel, really was marrying into not just a royal line, the line of Tyre and Sidon through King Ethbaal, but he was marrying into this whole system of mercantile traffic. That is, the merchants of Tarshish, who are so roundly criticized in Ezekiel 27. And these merchants captured the trade of the entire world and operated under their own law. It's interesting, by the way, that Ethbaal, the father of Jezebel, got into his position of power by killing off the last of the line of Hiram and placing himself in power. so that he got into power by all kinds of chicanery. And he, according to Josephus, was a priest of Baal. His daughter Jezebel was a priestess of Baal.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So here is a merchant of Tarshish who becomes the king of Tyre.
Right.
And of course, in Jeremiah's prophecy against Tyre, he refers to the king behind the king being the one who was in the Garden of Eden. That would be in the next chapter.
Oh, yeah.
Lucifer himself. He's the true king of the merchants of Tarshish.
Absolutely. So that although the battle appears to be an earthly battle, it's really a heavenly battle, because there's a controller, an invisible controller of this whole Babylonian system, both of commerce and of false religion.
Yeah, and it's interesting that these men could become so wealthy as they traded commodities from one country to another. We would have to call that the beginning of the international merchant, international trade.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing about it is when they went to the different countries, they did not necessarily deal in the currency of that particular country, but they were able to exchange the money. So they became money changers. Does that sound familiar to you? Jesus overthrew the tables of the money changers on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in the first century. If you can imagine such a thing, these men had power that spread far and wide.
Now, it's always a mistake to marry into the world system. And if anyone ever illustrated that, it would be Ahab marrying Jezebel. Jezebel, by the way, is a type, J.R., of the woman in Revelation called Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots.
Yes.
And Ahab married into the world. He married into the system of global commerce, which in his case was Mediterranean, Europe, and African. But the Phoenician traders also went east to India, so really it could almost be called international trade in his day.
Yes.
He married into that system. They had a child, Athaliah, or Athalia, or Athaliah. We've been debating about how her name is to be pronounced.
But she too was a priestess in this Baal worship. The worship of Ishtar and Baal, or Ashtaroth.
Yeah, we read about her in 2 Kings and in Chronicles. Immediately upon the decline and death of Jezebel and Ahab, she began scheme in the royal household, tried to kill off the princes of the royal house, and would have succeeded, except one of them was hidden.
Yeah.
But she ruled for
Little Joash.
Joash was saved because he was hidden. But in the process of all this, she managed to rule for 6 years and virtually destroyed Israel.
Turned the temple in Jerusalem into a pagan temple, if you can imagine such a thing.
Yeah.
And finally, though, she was killed by an uprising, and Joash became the king at age 8.
Right.
8 years old. Now that's a microcosm, or a prophetic scenario set up for the future Antichrist, who is going to attempt to do basically the same thing all over again.
Exactly.
So we have stories in the Bible that relate to the far future and the time of the tribulation period. When we see Mystery Babylon here in chapters 17 and 18, we must consider the fact that even though John was writing concerning the Roman Empire and the Caesars of Rome and the vast empire, the commodities and merchant trading that Rome had established in that day, he was looking into the far future to the final destruction of what he saw that was really moving on, picking up a lot of head of steam in his day.
J.R., I would like to mention, again, for those who might not have been with us in our first study, that Ezekiel 27 defines the merchants of Tarshish in the lament over Tyre. That is, the king of Tyre is the king of the whole system, started it all off, but the merchants who operated under him were called the merchants of Tarshish. They traded around the world. They had their own maritime merchant law, which transcended any particular national law. And, by the way, as merchants of Tarshish, they became the prophetic prototype of the merchants that we encounter later on. For example, in Ezekiel 38, when Gog invades Israel, the merchants of Tarshish and all the young lions thereof together with Sheba and Dedan, whom we know to be the United Arab Emirates and their consorts.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia.
Kuwait.
And others, the oil producers, gather together with the merchants of Tarshish and say to Gog, "Hast thou come to take us spoil?" Yeah. In other words, are you going to try to cut in on our business?
Yeah. And you know, Gary, this is the point that we really would like to make. Wars are fought over merchant law, not just, you know, not just any law. But when Iraq went into Kuwait, we went to war against Iraq, not because Iraq went into a little country and annexed it, but because of the oil that was there. And all wars are fought over what we call international law, which is the outcropping of this law merchant.
Now, the law merchant came through the Phoenician and Carthaginian traders into the Roman system, into the European system, and in the Middle Ages, something happened, and that is that these laws became codified. Now, I want to read a brief quote here from the Encyclopedia Americana. Quote, "Every province in France had a different legal system. Every German principality had its Landrecht, or land law. Every incorporated city had its liberties. Every guild had its institutions and ordinances. Every robber baron was a law unto himself. A lex maritima, that is a maritime law, was developed for mariners and oversea traders, and a lex mercatorium for merchants. The two last named had some claim to universality, for they were observed by the classes for which they were made throughout Europe, irrespective of nationality, and were administered and enforced by special courts. Their basic principles were taken from the Roman law, as were those of the all-pervading canon law, and in these three systems, the jus civilis, or the civil justice, manifested the most of its posthumous power." So what this is saying is that out of the civil justice system of Roman law, there came two other kinds of law, the common law and the lex mercatorium, or the merchant law. And the thing that made merchant law so interesting is it didn't have to adhere to any particular land law, but rather transcended all of them. It was a law above all other laws.
And you know, after Carthage, which was, we said in the last program, meant new city, which was a continuation of the merchants of Tarshish, then they moved to a new center of commerce, Lombardia, Italy. And today, the London Financial District, 22 acres of land where the Bank of England and all the international banks are located, including the London Stock Exchange, there is an avenue that runs down through this London Financial District called Lombard Avenue, take off from Lombardia. So you can see the connection to the past, to these law merchants of the past. And the fascinating thing about this is that the 22 acres of land upon which the Bank of England sits is not a part of England. It is a little international law merchant area all to its own. It's kind of interesting. It's like the Vatican right in the middle, heart of Rome, but it's not a part of Rome, not a part of Italy. It's a separate country, in effect, unto itself. This is true also of the United Nations. The building in New York City and the property of the United Nations is international territory. It's aloof from the laws of the United States or even of New York City or of New York State.
That's correct.
And then we have Washington, D.C., which is not a part of the state. Somebody's been wanting to make it another state, you know. It's not a part of Maryland. It's in the district of, what's her name?
Columbia is her name. Columbia.
That's the same as Europa, the same as Ashtaroth and Ishtar and so on.
That's
this
right.
Same goddess of the law merchant.
Exactly.
Incredible.
Now, J.R., there's something interesting here. we need to discuss a new term, and that is the concept of neutrality. Again, reading from the Encyclopedia Americana on the subject of neutrality. It says here, and I quote, "A neutral merchant vessel, according to the code prepared by the Research in International Law, is, quote, a merchant vessel entitled to fly the flag of a neutral state." So what we have now in modern law is, for example, let's take an oil tanker. It may belong to Occidental Petroleum, and Occidental Petroleum then is a parent corporation, and that corporation is controlled by what are called merchant bankers. By the way, I'm holding in my hand here a book by Joseph Vicksburg, the title of which is The Merchant Bankers. And Joseph Vicksburg is the son of the Vicksburg family, one of the early merchant bankers. And he proudly writes of the accomplishments of 7 financial families of the world. And he entitles his book, The Merchant Bankers. And very, very proud of their heritage. Yeah. Now, these merchant bankers, for example...
On the back it says secret fraternity.
It does. On the back it says the secret fraternity. It does, indeed.
That's incredible, Gary.
These
are the movers and shakers. These are the offspring, the dynasty of what was in the Bible called the merchants of Tarshish.
Right.
And these are, shall we say, the makers of Mystery Babylon the Great. This is the real nuts and bolts of the thing. Now, they've been busy buying up the world over the past several years.
They have, and they're operating under the code of neutrality. That oil tanker we talked about a minute ago, owned by a merchant banker, it might say Occidental Petroleum on the side. But it might fly, and in fact, many, many oil tankers do fly the Liberian flag. Liberia is a very small, neutral country in Northwest Africa. And
how convenient.
Isn't that convenient?
Yeah, and then they have their international banks, like in the Grand Cayman Islands, and what have you, you know, and they do that so they won't have to pay income taxes and owe allegiance to any particular country.
Indeed.
This is incredible that they should be able to set up such a thing. The fascinating thing is, why doesn't the government of the United States stop these industrial companies in the United States whose corporate headquarters are offshore? Why don't they stop them? Well, because those politicians, listen carefully, those politicians are bought and paid for. What can I say? Now, you've got to understand that the United States, a couple of hundred years ago, when we became a nation, were unlike any other nation in the whole world because we were not controlled by the international bankers. They could not keep the lid on America. We had a government that we elected by vote. And we established the same kind of credit line that these merchant bankers have. And we allowed the average citizen to have the ability of credit, which means that we could capitalize our own businesses. And so America grew affluent. The Industrial Revolution. And America became rich among all the nations, and everybody else in the world wanted to come to America because they knew that in America you could capitalize your business by borrowing the money. But I want you to know that in this century, since 1913, with the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, the international banking cartel has taken over America's credit line. And we are being told in the last decade, Americans, tighten your belt, learn to live with less. Less is better, you know. That's what they've been trying to tell us. And now, Gary, we have reached the socialization of America.
Indeed.
Where the government wants to make us socialized, socialism, instead of democracy. And that may sound good because they're giving you free medical. But the truth of the matter is, nothing comes free. You have to give up your freedom to do that. And so eventually you become enslaved. This is their goal, isn't it, Gary?
Indeed it is. Now, there's something else about this, and you mentioned it a minute ago. You mentioned that in the District of, and you call it Columbia, there is it's sort of a separate district. It's not really a state. It's a governing region.
That's been for 200 years. They've kept it from becoming a state for 200 years. They have a reason for that.
And you know, it's kind of interesting that there's a lady on the top of a big building right in the middle of that district called the Capitol.
Yes.
And this lady is a goddess. And she's called, I've seen her variously referred to as the goddess of freedom or the goddess of liberty.
Uh-huh.
But our thanks to a Prophecy in the News viewer who reminded us that the goddess Mithra is the foundational goddess for all of these statues.
That takes us back to Babylon.
It takes us right back to Babylon and also to Roman London, because the pagan goddess Mithra was the goddess of ancient London, which was a banking center for the Romans. And she was called the goddess of light. She was the goddess also, and get this, of contract and friendship. That means, I believe in you, I'll give you credit. Or friendship, I believe in you, I will extend to you my business. In the 3rd century AD, Diocletian declared Mithras the protectors of the Roman Empire. And statues of Mithras had rays coming out of their crowns, rays of light. And one final word, she was the protecting goddess of the banking center of London. Now, J.R., I believe that Mithra descends directly from Ishtar,
yes,
who was also the pagan goddess of friendship and contracts that governed the king of Tyre and the merchants of Tarshish in the old days of the Phoenicians.
The mystery now is unraveled. Mystery Babylon is that ancient merchant system that has grown today to an international banking cartel that has literally taken over the countries of the world. What's so fascinating to me about all of this, Gary, is that Americans are now giving away our freedom. We're allowing these bought and paid for politicians, these Rhodes Scholars and those who have received their education in the halls of Oxford and the Bank of England to take away America's freedom. And eventually it will ultimately erupt in a demand of a mark in the right hand or in the forehead before men can buy or sell. Therefore, what America has enjoyed for these past 200 years, for example, what the citizens of Mexico have not enjoyed because they were kept in poverty, no one able to get any credit and borrow any money to start any businesses, and America has, it's going to be a thing of the past, except Jesus is coming and he's going to put a stop. As James said, go to now, you rich men, weep and howl. Look up, Jesus is coming soon.